good evening, or perhaps good night, wherever you are and however your day has unfolded. I invite you now to settle in. Find a comfortable place. Let your body grow still. If you are lying in bed, allow your pillow to hold you gently the way it always does. If you are sitting somewhere quiet, let your back relax and your shoulders drift down, soft and loose. You are safe here. There is no need to do anything, no need to prepare or plan. You can simply listen with no pressure to remember the words, no requirement to follow every detail. The story will flow along like a quiet stream. You can listen closely if you'd like, or let your thoughts wander if they prefer. The words will be here, carrying you along gently, whether you pay attention or whether you drift toward sleep. Tonight, we are going to take a slow and peaceful journey into the past, back to a time long before electricity, before cars, before airplanes or screens, back to the 18th century, when the land that would become the United States was still a cluster of British colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast. We often hear about the American Revolution in bold and dramatic terms: battles, declarations, fireworks, famous names. But tonight, we will tell the story differently. We will let the loud parts soften and instead focus on the quiet details, the daily lives of ordinary people, the rhythms of their days, the things they ate, the way they built their homes, the way they gathered with neighbors, and how slowly, gently, their world began to shift. This will not be a lecture, nor a list of facts. Instead, imagine someone sitting beside you, speaking in a calm and steady voice, sharing a long and winding story that asks nothing of you except to listen or to drift away into dreams when you ready. So, take a slow breath in and let it out. Feel your body growing heavier with each exhale. And let us step quietly into the past, into the soft, candlelit world of the American colonies on the eve of the Revolution. When we think of the American Revolution, it is tempting to leap straight to soldiers in uniforms, to George Washington on horseback, to the stirring words of the Declaration of Independence. But those moments, the ones remembered in textbooks, were only a brief part of the story. Before the Revolution, there were decades, generations, in fact, of everyday life in the colonies. And in those quiet lives, we can find the roots of the Revolution itself. Let's picture, for a moment, a small town in New England around the year 1750, 25 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed. The houses are made of wood, many with steeply pitched roofs to let the snow slide off in the winter. There are no streetlights, only lanterns hung here and there, casting golden circles of light onto dirt paths. At night, the town grows very dark, the kind of darkness that modern eyes rarely see. Above, the stars shine with a brightness that feels almost close enough to touch. In the center of the town, there might be a meeting house, plain, square, and simple, often painted white or left in bare wood. The meeting house is not just for church services on Sunday, but also for town gatherings, announcements, and decisions. It is a place where voices rise, but also where neighbors come together week after week. Life in these colonies was slower than we can easily imagine today. A day's rhythm followed the rising and setting of the sun. When the first light crept into the sky, families stirred. Fires were rekindled in the hearth, bread was baked, and animals were fed. There were cows to be milked, chickens to be let out of their coops, and fields to be tended. Children, even the young ones, often had tasks of their own. A boy of 10 might fetch water from the well or help chop wood. A girl of the same age might spin flax into thread or learn to sew alongside her mother. Education was valued, but it was not the only priority. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught in small schoolhouses, often one room with a single teacher for all ages. But equally important was learning how to manage a household, how to grow food, how to survive in a world where much depended on your own hands. Meals were simple but filling. In New England, corn was a staple: cornbread, corn mush, corn porridge. There might be fish from nearby rivers, or pork salted down to last through the winter. Families drank cider, made from apples that grew abundantly in the region, and beer that was brewed at home. Tea, imported from far across the sea, was a special treat, though one that would later become the center of political protests. The clothes people wore were sturdy and practical. Men in towns might wear breeches, waistcoats, and shirts with long sleeves, while women wore dresses with aprons and caps. Clothing was often made at home, spun and woven from flax or wool. Colors were muted dyes from plants and roots, created shades of brown, gray, soft blues, and earthy reds. Bright fabrics were expensive, and only wealthier families could afford them. The evenings were quiet, with no electricity. Light came from candles or the flickering glow of the hearth. Families often gathered together in the main room of their home, sewing, mending, reading aloud from the Bible or from the few books they owned. Sometimes neighbors would stop by and stories would be told by firelight. Outside, the night stretched long and still, broken only by the sounds of crickets, owls, or the distant barking of a dog. And while the days were busy with work, the pace was steady rather than hurried. Travel was slow, done on foot, by horse, or in carriages over bumpy roads. A trip to a neighboring town might take hours, even if it was only a few miles away. Letters traveled across the ocean by ship, taking weeks or months to arrive. News moved slowly, and people often lived their lives with little awareness of distant events. It was in this world, quiet, patient, bound by the seasons that the seeds of the revolution were planted. People lived ordinary lives, yet beneath the surface, change was stirring. The colonies were growing. More ships were arriving in harbors like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Trade was expanding, and with it came new ideas, new voices, new questions. But for now, before the storm of history, life was steady. Children laughed as they played games like marbles or hoop rolling. Farmers tilled their fields. Mothers taught daughters to cook over wide hearths. Fathers passed down carpentry skills or showed their sons how to plow a straight furrow. And at night, when the candles were snuffed out and the fire burned low, families drifted to sleep under heavy quilts, the sounds of the countryside lulling them into rest. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might imagine the shape of a colonial home. Not the grand houses of wealthy merchants, but the simpler dwellings of ordinary families, the kind of houses that dotted the countryside, where most people lived. The walls were often made of wood, cut and fitted by hand, or in some regions, built from brick if the clay and skill were available. The roof might be thatched with straw or covered in shingles, uneven but strong. Windows were small, sometimes with panes of glass if the family could afford them, or else shutters that could be opened in summer and closed tight against the winter winds. Inside, the house was warm and practical. The hearth was the heart of the home, wide, deep, and carefully tended. It was where meals were cooked, where warmth was gathered, and where light flickered in the evenings. Families sat close to the fire, not only for heat, but for company, for conversation, and for the comfort of that steady glow. The floors were wooden, worn smooth by footsteps. In some homes, rugs were laid down, woven from wool or braided from scraps of cloth. In others, the floors were bare and swept daily with brooms made from twigs or stiff grasses. The furniture was simple, sturdy wooden chairs, a table, perhaps a chest for storage, or shelves lined with pewter dishes and clay mugs. Beds were filled with straw or feathers, covered with quilts that mothers and daughters had stitched together in patient hours of sewing. Each room carried the smell of daily life smoke from the hearth, bread baking in the oven, herbs drying in bunches hung from the rafters. In winter, the scent of apples stored in barrels might linger. In summer, fresh air drifted in through open shutters, carrying the scent of fields and earth. Meals, though plain by modern standards, were prepared with great care. Families worked hard to preserve enough food for the seasons, and the rhythm of cooking followed the rhythm of the year. In spring, fresh greens emerged, and families enjoyed the taste of young lettuces, asparagus, and peas after the long winter. In summer, gardens provided beans, squash, and cucumbers. In autumn, orchards gave apples, and fields yielded corn and pumpkins. And in winter, Preserved foods, salted meats, dried beans, pickled vegetables, kept families fed until spring returned. Bread was a staple. Cornmeal was often used. Families made cornbread, johnny cakes, or mush thick and filling, eaten with milk or syrup. Wheat bread was more expensive, but where wheat was grown, it too found its way to the table. Meat, when it was available, was usually pork or chicken, raised at home, or fish caught in nearby rivers and seas. Beef was less common, as cattle were valuable for milk and labor. But when a cow grew old, or when the community gathered for a butchering, beef was enjoyed in hearty stews or roasted slowly over the fire. Butter was churned by hand in tall wooden churns, with steady and patient movements. Children often helped, pushing the dasher up and down, waiting for the moment when the cream thickened into soft golden butter. Cheese, too, was made in many homes, pressed into rounds, and stored in cool places. Tea, imported from Britain, was a luxury that many households enjoyed when they could. It was sipped from delicate cups, sometimes with sugar if the family could afford it. But more often, drinks were local apple cider, small beer brewed at home, or milk warmed by the hearth. Cooking was not only nourishment, but also labor. Meals required hours of preparation, kneading dough, tending stews, turning spits of roasting meat, stirring porridge so it would not scorch. Women, and often older daughters, carried the weight of this work, balancing it with spinning, sewing, cleaning, and caring for younger children. Yet, in the rhythm of these tasks, there was also comfort. The routines were steady, passed down from mother to daughter, familiar in their repetition. Beyond meals, the home was also a place of craft and creation. Clothes were not bought in stores, but made and mended at home. Spinning wheels hummed as flax and wool were twisted into thread. Looms, where they were owned, stood in corners, weaving cloth in slow, careful patterns. Needles flashed in lamplight as seams were stitched, holes patched, hems adjusted. Children often wore hand-me-downs, garments passed from one sibling to another until the fabric wore thin. Aprons protected dresses, and stockings were darned again and again. Shoes were precious, often made by local cobblers and carefully maintained. In summer, children sometimes went barefoot, letting their shoes rest for the colder months. The work of keeping a home was steady, but it was not all toil. There were small joys woven into the fabric of the day. The smell of fresh bread steaming from the oven, the satisfaction of a newly finished quilt, its colors bright against the wooden walls, the laughter of children playing outside, running barefoot in the grass, the comfort of family gathered close at night, reading by candlelight or sharing stories passed down through generations. And though the homes were modest, they were strong. They sheltered families through long winters, protected them from summer storms, and stood as the heart of life in the colonies. Each home was its own small world, built with hands, filled with care, and warmed by the steady glow of the hearth. If you imagine the people of the American colonies in the years before the Revolution, you might picture them in their clothing first. Clothing was one of the clearest markers of time and place, and it was also one of the rhythms of daily life, woven, sewn, worn, mended, and sometimes passed down through generations. Clothes were rarely abundant. For most families, each person had only a handful of garments, carefully made and carefully kept. Everyday clothing was plain and practical, suited to work and weather. Best clothing was reserved for Sundays, for worship, or for important gatherings. In towns, wealthier families might show finer fabrics, dyed in richer colors, or trimmed with lace and buttons brought from overseas. But even the wealthiest still lived in a world where clothing was crafted slowly by hand. For men, the common outfit was built in layers. A long shirt of linen, worn beneath breeches trousers that fastened just below the knee. Over the shirt, a waistcoat, which might be plain or patterned, depending on what the family could afford. In colder weather, a coat or jacket was added, with wide cuffs and sturdy seams. Hats were almost universal felt, hats with wide brims, sometimes shaped with a trim, or knitted caps for working outdoors. Shoes were made of leather, buckled or tied, and often resoled again and again as they wore thin. Women's clothing was also layered. A shift of linen formed the base, long and simple, worn next to the skin. Over it, stays were laced supportive garments that shaped the body and provided structure. Skirts, often more than one, were tied around the waist, with aprons worn on top to protect them from dirt and wear. Bodices or gowns covered the upper body, with sleeves that might be short or long, depending on the season. Around the shoulders, women wore kerchiefs or shawls, folded neatly, sometimes fastened with a pin, and on the head, almost always, a cap of linen, called a mob cap, which framed the face and kept hair tidy. Children dressed much like adults, though their clothes were smaller and simpler. Young boys wore gowns much like girls, until they were old enough, round 6 or 7, to be breeched and given their first pair of breeches. This moment was often marked as a small rite of passage, a sign of growing up. Girls wore shifts, skirts, and aprons, learning from an early age how to dress and move in layers of fabric. Laundry was a major task. With no machines, everything was done by hand, usually in large wooden tubs. Clothes were scrubbed with lye soap, rinsed in cold water, and wrung out before being hung to dry in the sun or by the hearth. It was heavy work, often done once a week, and it left hands raw from soap and water. Because of the effort, clothing was worn many times before being washed. Linen shifts, which absorbed sweat and body oils, were washed most often, while outer garments might be brushed and shaken, but cleaned less frequently. Beyond clothing, customs filled the rhythm of life in the colonies. The calendar was marked not only by seasons of planting and harvest, but also by Sundays and holy days, by market days, and by local gatherings. Sunday was the central day of rest and worship. Families walked or rode to the meeting house, often traveling miles to reach the center of town. Services could last for hours, with long sermons that tested patience, especially for children. Yet these gatherings were also a time to see neighbors, to share news, and to feel part of a larger community. After the service, families might linger outside, speaking with friends, arranging trades, or exchanging letters brought from distant places. In towns, market days brought bustle and color. Farmers brought in produce, eggs, butter, and cheese. Craftsmen displayed tools, furniture, or handmade goods. Merchants offered fabrics, imported goods, or small luxuries from overseas. The sound of barter filled the air, voices negotiating, laughter spilling out in pockets, the steady rhythm of coins exchanging hands. Social life often revolved around neighbors. Quilting bees brought women together, sewing side by side as they pieced bright scraps into blankets that would warm families in the winter. Barn raisings and harvest gatherings brought men to shared labor, lifting timbers into place or gathering crops before the weather turned. These events were as much about companionship as they were about work. With so much labor required for survival, sharing it lightened the burden, and it also gave opportunities for conversation, for shared meals, and for songs sung together. Music, though simple, was a part of daily life. Fiddles were common, their strings carrying lively tunes in kitchens and taverns. Flutes and fifes, brought by immigrants, added gentle notes to gatherings. Families sang hymns and ballads, voices rising together in harmony. Many songs were carried across the ocean from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Africa, blending into new sounds that reflected the diverse lives of the colonies. Evenings, as always, were slow. After the day's work, people sat by candlelight or firelight. Some read aloud the Bible most often, but also almanacs, which were popular for their mix of weather forecasts, farming advice, and bits of wisdom. Children might play games with pebbles, hoops, or simple toys carved from wood. Adults mended clothes, sharpened tools, or simply sat in quiet conversation. The rhythms of life were steady, built from tasks repeated day after day. Yet in their steadiness there was comfort. The colonies were young, and challenges were many. Winters were cold, summers were hot, and survival required constant effort. But families built patterns of living that gave shape to their days, and in those patterns they found a kind of peace. For now, in the soft light of the 1750s and early 1760s, life in the colonies followed these gentle rhythms of clothing spun and sewn, of customs observed, of neighbors gathering, of children laughing in fields, and of families ending each day with the same comfort: a home, a fire, and rest. If you close your eyes and imagine a small colonial town in the 1760s, you might picture the familiar routines we have already described: the hearth fires, the farm chores, the gathering at the meeting house. Life went on with its steady rhythm, but in the background quietly, almost like the faint sound of distant waves, political change was beginning to stir. Most people did not wake up each morning thinking of governments or kings. Their first thoughts were of breakfast, of cows that needed milking, or of tools to be mended. Yet slowly, gently, new questions began to arrive in daily conversation. They came not all at once, but like a trickle of water that grows into a stream. These questions often arrive in the form of paper. Ships from across the Atlantic carried letters, newspapers, and pamphlets. When the ships reached the harbors Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, the news spread outward, carried on horseback, on foot, and in the bags of post riders. A single newspaper might be read by dozens of people, passed from hand to hand, its pages worn soft by many fingers. In taverns, where travelers and locals gathered, news was read aloud. Imagine a low-ceilinged room, warm with firelight, the smell of ale and smoke in the air. A man unfolds a sheet of paper, smoothing the creases with his palm, and begins to read in a steady voice. Around him, neighbors lean close, listening, nodding, or frowning. Some words are unfamiliar, but the tone carries meaning: questions about taxes, about distant laws, about decisions made by people who lived far away across the ocean. Taxes were not new. Colonists had long paid duties on goods, and they accepted, to some degree, the rule of Britain. But the 1760s brought new measures that felt heavier, less distant, more intrusive: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, words that sound sharp even now. But in those days, they arrived like ripples spreading across still water. The Sugar Act placed duties on molasses, which was used to make rum, a common trade item. The Stamp Act required that legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards carry a paid stamp. For wealthy merchants, this was a direct burden. For printers, lawyers, and tavern owners, it touched their daily business. And for ordinary families, it meant that news, paper, and even small pleasures became more costly. At first, many colonists grumbled quietly. They wondered why a king so far away should decide the price of their paper, or whether their cider or rum should be taxed. Some shrugged and accepted it. Others spoke in low tones of unfairness. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," was not shouted in every household right away. It was whispered, first in pamphlets, then in taverns, then in town meetings. Representation, having a voice in the decisions made, was something the colonists valued in their local governments. Towns elected leaders, held votes, and debated decisions. To be taxed without such a voice felt too many like a slow tightening of the reins. But even as these ideas spread, daily life continued. Farmers planted and harvested. Children learned to read from hornbooks and slates. Mothers taught daughters to spin flax into fine linen thread. The political shifts were like weather patterns far on the horizon, noticed, but not yet stormy. Pamphlets became especially important in this quiet stirring. They were small, inexpensive to print, and easy to distribute. Writers like John Dickinson and later Thomas Paine used simple, clear words that ordinary people could understand. These pamphlets might be read aloud in kitchens, in shops, or by candlelight at night. They spoke of rights, of liberty, of fair treatment, and they reached ears that had never heard such ideas put so plainly. In many ways, the political discussions blended into the customs of social life. After a quilting bee, women might pause to mention the rising cost of imported fabric. After church, men might linger outside, talking not only of weather and crops, but of the latest letter from Boston. Children, listening nearby, might not understand all the words, but they heard the tone of their parents' soft concern, quiet curiosity, or sometimes gentle indignation. The revolution was not born from sudden anger, but from these slow, steady conversations that spread across fields and fences, kitchens and taverns, towns and villages. Yet it is important to remember that for many, the larger political questions remained background noise. Survival and family life were the priority. A farmer worried more about whether his crops would grow than whether a distant parliament debated taxes. A mother cared more about keeping her children fed and warm through winter than about whether her tea carried a duty. Still, the background was changing. Tea, sugar, paper things, once taken for granted now, carried the weight of politics. And with each passing year, the questions grew louder, though still softened by distance. One can imagine a household at night, a father reading aloud by the fire, a newspaper in hand. The children half listen, half drift to sleep. The mother mends clothes, the needle moving steadily through fabric. Outside, the wind rustles through trees, and the stars gleam above the darkened town. Inside, words of change mingle with the steady rhythm of domestic life. The revolution had not yet arrived. There were no drums, no marches, no declarations, but beneath the surface, the ground was shifting quietly, like earth before a spring thaw. The people of the colonies were beginning to think of themselves not only as subjects of a distant king, but as communities with voices of their own. And just as seeds lie quietly beneath the soil before they sprout, these ideas were waiting small, almost invisible, but ready to grow when the time was right. Not all colonists lived in isolated farmhouses or country homesteads. Many lived in towns, and some in larger villages that served as hubs of activity. These places were modest compared to cities of Europe, but in their time they were lively, connected, and full of the small sounds of daily life. If you picture one of these towns, perhaps Boston, perhaps Philadelphia, perhaps Williamsburg, you might imagine narrow streets of packed dirt lined with wooden or brick buildings. In the morning, the sound of horses' hooves echoed along the lanes, and carts creaked as they carried goods to market. The air carried many scents, at once fresh bread from a baker's oven, smoke from chimneys, fish from the harbor, leather and wood from craftsmen's shops. The center of a town was often its marketplace. Here, farmers from the surrounding countryside brought produce, eggs, and butter to sell. Stalls were set up, simple wooden tables or barrels used as makeshift counters. Voices rose in conversation as neighbors greeted each other, bartering for goods or exchanging news. Children darted between adults, clutching pennies or small coins to buy sweets, perhaps a stick of molasses candy or gingerbread wrapped in paper. Dogs wove through the crowd, tails wagging, sniffing at baskets of food. It was not a grand marketplace by modern standards, but it was alive with a steady rhythm, the hum of trade and community. In towns, craftsmen were plentiful. Blacksmiths worked in open forges, their hammers ringing against iron, shaping tools, nails, and horseshoes. Carpenters planed wood into smooth boards, building furniture, carts, and houses. Tailors stitched fine coats for wealthier citizens, while cobblers mended worn shoes, stretching their usefulness for another season. Each trade had its place, and each was vital to the life of the town. Taverns stood as gathering places, not only for travelers, but for locals as well. Inside, the air was warm and lively. Some played cards, others discussed crops or shipping news. Travelers shared stories from distant places, their words carrying the flavor of lands most colonists would never see. And in the corner, a fiddler might play, his bow gliding across strings as feet tapped in time. Schools in towns were usually small, one-room buildings with wooden benches and a single teacher. Children of many ages sat together, reciting lessons, scratching letters onto slates, or reading from hornbooks, wooden paddles with sheets of paper attached, covered by thin, transparent horn. Learning was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and often memorization of religious texts. Discipline was strict, with the teacher's rod a reminder of order. Yet many children learned enough to read the Bible, to write letters, and to keep accounts, a skill that served them well in trade and in daily life. Churches or meeting houses stood as both spiritual and social centers. On Sundays, bells rang out, summoning families in their best clothes. The pews filled with neighbors, their faces lit by shafts of sunlight streaming through small paned windows. Sermons were long, but they were also a chance to gather, to see friends and family, and to share in a sense of community. Afterward, the meeting house steps buzzed with conversation: who had married, who was ill, who had returned from a long journey. Villages, smaller than towns, held a quieter charm. A cluster of houses around a green, perhaps, with a mill on the river and a small schoolhouse nearby. The mill was often the heart of such places, grinding grain into flour, its wheel turning slowly in the stream. The sound of rushing water and creaking wood was constant, familiar, and reassuring. Life in towns and villages was not without hardship. Fires were a danger, and with buildings close together, flames could spread quickly. Diseases, too, moved easily through crowded places, and epidemics sometimes struck with harsh results. But alongside these challenges was a sense of togetherness. Neighbors knew each other's names, faces, and families. Help was offered in times of need, and news spread not just through newspapers, but by word of mouth across fences, streets, and tavern tables. At night, the towns grew quiet. Candles were snuffed out, shutters closed, and the streets darkened. The glow of lanterns flickered in a few windows, but most homes fell silent. The only sounds were the rustle of wind, the clop of a late rider's horse, or the bark of a watchman making his rounds. The stars, free from city lights, shone brilliantly above the rooftops, reminding all who looked up that they were part of a wider, mysterious world. These towns and villages, modest though they were, became the stage upon which the revolution slowly unfolded. It was in taverns that debates were sparked, in marketplaces that rumors spread, in churches that sermons hinted at liberty, and in schools that children learned the words of freedom. But for now, in the years before open conflict, they were simply places of human life, ordinary, steady, and familiar. And as families closed their doors each evening, gathering by the hearth or climbing into bed, they carried with them the same hopes and worries of all people in all times, for health, for food, for safety, for peace. History often remembers its figures as statues, as paintings, as names in bold print. But before they were symbols, they were people living within the same daily rhythms as their neighbors. They rose in the morning, they ate meals, they read by candlelight, they worried, they rested. Tonight, let us meet a few of them not in marble or bronze, but in soft detail. George Washington. George Washington is often remembered as tall, commanding, dressed in military uniform. But at Mount Vernon, his Virginia home, he was also a farmer, a neighbor, and a man who enjoyed the quiet routines of plantation life. He woke early, often before dawn. He was fond of order, and his household reflected this. He kept careful records of his farm, noting which fields grew wheat, which pastures held livestock, how many barrels of flour were shipped from his mill. He took pride in agriculture, experimenting with crops and methods, walking the fields with a calm but watchful eye. At breakfast, he might have hoe-cake simple cornmeal cakes served with honey and tea. He preferred meals that were hearty but not extravagant. His table welcomed guests, sometimes neighbors, sometimes travelers, often with conversation about crops, weather, and the steady rhythms of the countryside. Washington was known for his silence, not unfriendly, but thoughtful. He spoke when he had something to say, and otherwise observed. Those around him noticed his presence, steady and calm, like a tall oak standing quietly in a field. In the evenings, he read by candlelight. Books on agriculture, essays, and newspapers filled his shelves. But perhaps more than anything, he valued order, his papers neatly arranged, his house in good repair, his fields well tended. When sleep came, it was likely with the weariness of honest labor and with the comfort of a man who found peace in steady routines. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was many things: printer, writer, scientist, inventor, diplomat. But he was also a man of habits, of daily rituals that gave structure to his busy mind. He rose early, famously asking himself each morning, "What good shall I do this day?" His mornings began with a wash of cold water, which he believed to be bracing and healthful. He enjoyed simple meals, bread, milk, fruit. He often worked at his printing press, setting type, pulling sheets, ink staining his fingers. Franklin loved conversation. He could sit in a tavern for hours, discussing ideas with friends, listening, debating, laughing. His wit was sharp but playful, his manner sociable and inviting. He started clubs where men gathered to talk of books, philosophy, and public improvements. At home, he tinkered. He adjusted stoves, experimented with electricity, invented bifocals, devised musical instruments. His curiosity was restless, his mind always reaching. Yet he also enjoyed small comforts: a good meal, a glass of Madeira wine, a quiet evening with a book. In the evenings, he asked himself another question: what good have I done today? And with that gentle self-reflection, he often closed his day, ready to begin again in the morning. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, remembered as the writer of the Declaration of Independence, was also a man of deep routine. At Monticello, his Virginia estate, he lived as a planter, architect, and thinker. He rose with the sun. He loved gardening, and he recorded details of his plants with great care: the dates of planting, the success of crops, the behavior of the soil. He enjoyed simple breakfasts, tea, bread, perhaps fresh vegetables from his gardens. Jefferson loved books. His library grew to thousands of volumes, covering law, science, history, and philosophy. He read with steady devotion, often late into the night. He also loved music, playing the violin for his own pleasure, the notes drifting through the halls of his house. Though his writings changed history, his daily life was quiet. He oversaw the work of his plantation, wrote letters, designed buildings, and studied languages. He believed in the power of ideas, but he also found peace in the soil, in the steady growth of plants, in the quiet of the Virginia hills. John Adams, fiery in speech and thought, was also a farmer and a family man. At his home in Massachusetts, he balanced the work of fields with the duties of law and politics. He was devoted to his wife, Abigail, with whom he exchanged letters filled with warmth and wit. Together they raised children, tended gardens, and managed household affairs. Adams was fond of books, reading deeply in law and philosophy. He also enjoyed walks across the fields, the fresh air clearing his busy mind. Though known for his passionate debates, at home he was practical and steady. He worked the soil, repaired fences, oversaw livestock. He was not a distant figure, but a man with dirt on his boots and ink on his hands. In the evenings, with Abigail by his side, he read, wrote letters, and reflected. His world was not only of politics and nations, but of family and farm, of home and hearth. Were also people who sat down to meals, who walked fields, who lit candles at dusk. They lived within the same rhythms as their neighbors, rising with the sun, working with their hands or minds, gathering with family at night. And in this, they remind us that history is not only battles and declarations. It is also the quiet lives of those who, even as they shaped nations, still sought comfort in the small things: bread, books, gardens, and rest. When the War for Independence began in earnest in 1775, life in the colonies did not stop. Fields still needed planting. Children still needed to be fed, clothed, and taught. Homes still needed tending. But the rhythms of daily life began to shift, slowly at first, then more noticeably as the years went on. Most families were not soldiers on battlefields. They were farmers, mothers, children, craftsmen, neighbors. The war touched them in quieter ways through shortages, substitutions, small sacrifices, and long stretches of waiting. Shortages and substitutions. One of the earliest changes came in the form of scarcity. Imported goods grew harder to find. Ships that once brought fabric, sugar, tea, and tools from overseas were disrupted by blockades and conflict. Prices rose, and households adjusted as best they could. Tea, once a common pleasure, became rare. Families substituted herbs from their gardens, mint, sage, or dried raspberry leaves steeped in hot water. Some called it Liberty tea. Coffee, too, became a substitute when it could be obtained, though it was not as widespread. Sugar, expensive even before the war, grew scarce. Honey and maple syrup sweetened food in its place. Cloth, especially fine fabrics like silk or imported wool, was hard to come by. Women spun flax and wool at home, weaving plain but sturdy cloth. Homespun clothing became a symbol of patriotism as well as necessity. Salt, used to preserve meat, was another challenge. Without it, storing food for winter was harder. Families experimented with drying, smoking, and other methods, sharing knowledge with neighbors to stretch supplies. Women at the center, with many men away serving in militias, fighting with the Continental Army, or traveling for trade. Women carried much of the burden at home. They managed farms, oversaw planting and harvests, cared for livestock, and raised children, often with little assistance. In towns, women ran shops, baked bread for neighbors, and sewed uniforms for soldiers. Some followed armies as camp followers, cooking, washing, and nursing. But most remained at home, keeping households running with quiet strength. Letters between husbands and wives reveal the tenderness and worry of these years. A wife might write of the children's health, of the scarcity of flour, of the challenges of keeping the farm. A husband might reply with reassurances, with longing for home, with hope that the war would end soon. These letters, carried slowly by writers, were lifelines of connection, keeping families bound across distances. Children in wartime for children. The war years were both ordinary and extraordinary. They still played, helped with chores, and learned to read. Yet they also saw soldiers march through towns, heard the crack of muskets in the distance, or watched neighbors pack belongings and leave for safety. Some children gathered scraps of fabric to make bandages. Others collected herbs for medicine or carried water to tired workers. They grew up quickly, sensing the strain in their parents' voices, even if they did not understand all the reasons behind it. At the same time, they still found moments of joy. Games of marbles, rolling hoops, or singing songs around the fire continued, offering comfort in uncertain times. Their laughter was a reminder that even in war, life carried on. Taverns and news. In towns, taverns became even more important. With newspapers delayed or scarce, taverns were places where news arrived spoken by travelers, read aloud from letters, or pieced together from rumor. Imagine a room crowded with neighbors, fire crackling, the smell of ale in the air. A rider arrives with a packet of papers. The crowd leans close as someone reads aloud news of a battle hundreds of miles away, or of decisions made by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Reactions were quiet at first: a sigh, a murmur, a slow shake of the head. These moments brought the far-off events of war into the daily life of towns, binding communities together in shared listening. The quiet strain war also brought worry. Families wondered if husbands, sons, or brothers would return. Mothers listened at night for distant sounds, uncertain if danger would spread to their towns. Farmers fretted over whether crops would be seized or trampled. Merchants feared ships lost at sea, and yet life continued. Neighbors helped each other, sharing flour or wood when shortages grew severe. Communities gathered for barn raisings, for harvests, for quilting bees, holding on to traditions that gave comfort. The war was real, but so was the resilience of daily life. Nights during the war years, at night, after the long work of the day, households still gathered by the hearth. Candles flickered, shadows danced on wooden walls, and families sat close. Some evenings were heavy with worry, but others held moments of peace. A father might read a psalm, a mother might sing a lullaby. Children, tired from work and play, drifted to sleep beneath quilts stitched with care. Outside, the world was uncertain, but inside, within the walls of each home, there was the same desire that has always carried people through difficult times: the wish for safety, for warmth, for tomorrow's dawn. A gentle reflection: the war years are often remembered for battles and declarations, but for most, they were years of endurance, of making do, of finding comfort in small things, of carrying on quietly. Families spun thread, baked bread, tended gardens, and raised children, even as history turned around them. And perhaps in those quiet homes, we can glimpse the true strength of the revolution, not only in soldiers on the field, but in the countless acts of patience, care, and persistence that sustained daily life. Life in the 18th century moved at a different rhythm than ours today. There were fewer clocks, no trains or automobiles, no rushing hum of machines. Instead, life followed the pace of the sun, the turning of seasons, and the steady beat of footsteps, hooves, and wheels on dirt roads. During the years of the American Revolution, even with the uncertainty around them, people still found ways to rest, to move from place to place, and to gather in fellowship. These moments, simple and unhurried, offered balance to the work and worries of daily life. Rest and leisure at home for most families. Rest was found in the home. After a day of farm labor or shopkeeping, evenings unfolded slowly. Candles were lit, chairs pulled close to the hearth, and the family gathered. Leisure might mean reading a cherished book, if one was available, or listening as someone read aloud. The Bible was common, but so were almanacs, small collections of poems, or travel narratives. For many, listening was as important as reading, the voice carrying words into the quiet room, while others sewed, mended tools, or simply rested. Music was another comfort. A fiddle might be brought out, or a flute, or simply voices raised together in song. Hymns were sung, folk songs remembered, and sometimes new verses invented for amusement. Evenings could also hold games, checkers cards, or riddles passed back and forth. Rest also came in conversation. Families spoke of the day's work, of neighbors, of crops and weather. The war, though never far from mind, was not always the topic. People still shared stories, laughter, and simple reflections, weaving bonds of togetherness. Sleep itself was shaped by the natural world. Without electric light, evenings ended earlier, especially in winter, when nights were long. Many households practiced first sleep and second sleep, a pattern where people went to bed soon after dark, then woke for a few hours around midnight to pray, read, or talk quietly before returning to bed until dawn. Beds were simple but warm. Feather mattresses were prized, but many slept on straw tickings or rope beds stretched tight. Quilts, wool blankets, and coverlets layered against winter cold. Families often shared beds, especially children, their breathing a gentle rhythm through the night. Outside, the world was darker than we can easily imagine now. Only moonlight and starlight touched the land. The sound of owls, crickets, or the occasional distant dog carried through the stillness. It was a deeper kind of night, one that invited true rest. Travel by road and water when people needed to travel. The pace was slow. Horses were the main companions of the road, whether ridden directly or pulling carriages, wagons, or simple carts. A day's journey might cover 20 to 30 miles on horseback, less with a loaded wagon. Roads were rough, sometimes little more than dirt tracks lined with trees. In wet weather, they turned to mud. In dry months, dust rose behind wheels and hooves. Travelers paused at taverns along the Wear, esting, eating, and tending their animals. For those near rivers, boats offered another way to move. Flatboats carried goods downstream. Ferries crossed travelers from one bank to the other. Larger towns near the coast saw sloops and schooners carrying passengers as well as cargo. The motion of water travel was slower still, but it carried with it the soft sounds of waves, the creak of wood, and the call of birds overhead. Travel was rarely rushed. A letter might take weeks to arrive, a journey days longer than expected. People learned patience with distance, accepting that news, visitors, and goods came when they came, and no sooner. Gatherings and community gatherings were a cherished part of life. Church on Sundays was perhaps the most regular and important, not only for worship, but for fellowship. Neighbors met, exchanged news, and shared in the rhythm of community. Other gatherings came in the form of barn raisings, quilting bees, or harvest festivals. These were practical events, but also social ones. At a barn raising, men lifted timbers together, while women prepared food and children played nearby. Quilting bees brought women together around frames, stitching and chatting, their hands busy, their voices warm. Dances were another delight. Fiddles played, feet tapped, and neighbors joined in reels and jigs. These were not grand balls of the wealthy, but simple community dances held in taverns, barns, or homes cleared of furniture for the evening. The music, the laughter, and the swirl of skirts and boots offered relief from the strains of life. Inns and taverns played a special role in travel and gathering. For the weary traveler, they offered food, drink, and sometimes a shared bed. Meals might include stews, bread, cheese, and ale. The rooms were modest, but they were places of rest. For locals, taverns were places of conversation. Farmers, tradesmen, and travelers sat together at rough wooden tables. They spoke of crops, of weather, of politics, and of stories from far away. A tavern was not always quiet, but it was steady, familiar, and part of the fabric of community life. Gentle endurance, even in the midst of war. These patterns of rest, travel, and gathering continued. People found ways to maintain traditions, to celebrate small joys, and to care for one another. The rhythm of hooves on dirt roads, the glow of candlelight on a quilt, the sound of fiddles in a barn, these were the moments that gave balance to hardship. They remind us that history is not only made in declarations and battles, but also in the quiet persistence of daily life lived together. When we look back at history, we often see the larger events, declarations, battles, treaties. But behind those moments were countless small details, the quiet objects, habits, and beliefs that shaped everyday life. These are the threads that rarely appear in textbooks, yet they carry their own charm, like the faint patterns woven into the background of a quilt. Let us wander slowly among these forgotten details, pausing here and there, not to hurry, but to notice. Whether lore and old sayings, in a world without modern forecasts, people relied on signs from nature to predict the weather. Farmers watched the sky, the flight of birds, and even the behavior of insects. If the swallows fly high, they said, the weather will be fair. If the wind comes from the east, expect a storm. Red skies at sunset were taken as good omens for the next day. The call of frogs, the thickness of corn husks, or the way smoke rose from a chimney were read as signals. These sayings, passed down through generations, gave a sense of order in uncertain times. Even if they were not always true, they offered comfort, a way of listening to the natural world. Household objects. Homes of the 1770s were filled with tools and objects that seem curious to us now. There were warming pans, long-handled pans, filled with hot coals, slid between bed covers to chase away the chill before sleep. There were candle snuffers, designed to neatly extinguish a flame without scattering smoke. In kitchens, there were butter churns, with tall handles pushed up and down to turn cream into butter. There were spider skillets, with 3 legs to sit above the coals of a hearth. There were sugar nibbers, sharp little tools for breaking chunks from a solid cone of sugar. Each object carried its own rhythm of use, its own quiet presence in daily life. And though many are forgotten now, they once shaped the texture of every day. Time and the clock time moved differently in the 18th century. Many families had no clocks at all, or perhaps only a single tall case clock, ticking steadily in a hallway. Pocket watches were rare and precious. Instead, people marked the hours by the sun, by church bells, by the routines of labor. Morning began with the first light. Midday came with the height of the sun. Evening began when candles were lit. This slower sense of time gave days a gentler rhythm. Without constant minutes and seconds, people leaned into the natural flow, allowing tasks to stretch or shorten as needed. Old beliefs and superstitions, everyday life was sprinkled with small superstitions. Some believed that spilling salt brought bad luck unless a pinch was thrown over the shoulder. Others thought that a horseshoe nailed above a door would protect the home. Children were told not to rock an empty cradle, lest it invite misfortune. A cricket on the hearth was seen as a good omen, a promise of warmth and safety. Dreams, too, were often read as signs. A dream of clear water might mean good health. A dream of a storm could be a warning. These quiet beliefs were not always taken too seriously, but they added a touch of wonder to daily life. Lighting the night. Before gas lamps or electricity, night was illuminated by flickering light. Candles of tallow or beeswax burned steadily. Lanterns with punched tin sides cast patterned shadows. In wealthier homes, whale oil lamps gave a brighter glow. Candles were precious, often made at home in batches. Families learned to make them last, snuffing flames when not needed, saving stubs for melting into new ones. The soft, golden light shaped the mood of evenings, slower and gentler than today's bright bulbs. The almanac, one of the most common books in colonial homes, was the almanac. Printed each year, it offered a mix of calendars, weather predictions, farming advice, proverbs, and small amusements. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac was especially popular, filled with sayings that blended humor and wisdom. Lines like, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Or a penny saved is a penny earned became part of daily thought. The almanac was read aloud, consulted for planting times, and sometimes even used as a place to jot notes. It was both practical and entertaining, a small companion through the year. Clothing details. Clothing, too, carried forgotten details. Men wore breeches fastened at the knee, with stockings pulled high. Shoes were held by buckles, often plain pewter or brass. Women's gowns were tied and pinned, with pockets hidden beneath skirts, accessed through slits in the fabric. Aprons were common, not just for work, but as a daily layer of protection for clothing. Caps were worn indoors, keeping hair neat and tidy. In winter, cloaks and mitts kept out the cold. Dyes were made from plants, indigo for blue, madder for red, walnut holes for brown. Colors were often softer than the bright hues we imagine, but they carried their own warmth. Food curiosities, meals carried small details as well. Cornmeal was a staple, cooked into mush, bread, or Johnny cakes. Apple cider was a common drink, safer than water in many places. Molasses sweetened dishes and was stirred into porridge or baked into gingerbread. Cooking was done at the hearth with heavy pots and long-handled tools. Bread baked in brick ovens. Pies cooked in Dutch ovens, buried in coals. Meals were slower, but filled with care. Food was not wasted. Bones became broth. Leftovers were transformed into stews or hash. Every part was used, and meals reflected both thrift and creativity. Gentle tangents. Even in times of struggle, there were small pleasures. The scent of lavender hung to dry, the taste of fresh berries in summer, the feel of wool newly spun into yarn. Children might chase fireflies at dusk, cupping the tiny lights in their hands. Farmers might pause at a fence post, watching the sun set over fields. Neighbors might linger after a shared meal, speaking softly while the stars appeared. These are the forgotten details, the little textures of life that rarely make it into history books, yet they are what life truly felt like. A quiet reflection, the revolution was not only battles and leaders, it was also warming pans and almanacs, rocking chairs and fiddles, superstitions and candlelight. These details, so gentle and ordinary, remind us that the past was lived not as a series of grand events, but as countless small moments. And it is often in those quiet, ordinary moments that life feels most real then, as now. We have wandered together through the American Revolution, not as a tale of noise and battles, but as a quiet story of daily life. We have looked at homes and hearths, food and clothing, travel and gathering, forgotten objects and gentle customs. We have seen the revolution not only as history, but as life lived one day at a time. Now, As we come to the end of this long, slow telling, let us let the story soften even further. Let it settle like the last glow of a candle fading into stillness. The people of the 18th century lived at a pace that was slower than ours. Each day followed the light of the sun. Each season brought its own tasks, its own colors, its own foods. When winter came, families gathered close, keeping warm by the hearth. In spring, they planted, listening for the songs of birds returning. Summer was filled with long days, with fields of corn and wheat swaying in the breeze. Autumn brought harvests, feasts, and the turning of leaves. Their world moved gently, following rhythms older than memory. To think of their lives is to be reminded that we too can slow down, if only for a little while. Imagine now the quiet of a Revolutionary era night, the streets of a town empty, the last tavern shutters drawn, lanterns put out. Farms lie still, barns quiet, only the faint rustle of animals in their stalls. The sky is wide, stars sharp and clear, without the blur of modern lights. The moon glows softly over fields and rooftops. Inside, families lie resting, the steady sound of breath rising and falling. It is a deeper darkness than we know now, a night full of quiet, where the only sounds are natural wind in the trees, a creek murmuring, a night bird calling once and then falling silent. It is a night that invites rest, the comfort of small things. In all of history, people have found comfort in small things: a cup of warm drink by the fire, a quilt drawn close, a story told softly at the end of the day. These comforts do not change with time. They belong to all generations. The people of the Revolution found them just as we find them now. Think of a wooden chair pulled near the hearth, the glow of embers soft on the floor. Think of a candle burning low, its wax pooling slowly. Think of a cat curled on a cushion, or a dog sighing in sleep. These are the things that made life full then, and they are still with us now. As this long story drifts to an end, imagine yourself setting aside the almanac, letting the last candle be snuffed out, and settling into bed in a quiet room. The shutters are drawn. The quilt is warm. The sounds outside are soft and distant. The revolution has quieted, not in victory or defeat, but in rest, in the simple truth that every day, no matter how full of change, still ends with nightfall and sleep. The people of that time, like us, closed their eyes and let the world go still. Let your mind rest now, as theirs once did. Picture the stars above the colonies, shining gently over towns and fields, rivers and forests. Picture the slow turning of seasons, the steady rise and fall of days. Let go of words, let go of history, let go of thought. All that remains is quiet. All that remains is rest. Breathe deeply, settle softly, and drift into sleep.